Okay, so let's try this again. So for those of you who I have not met yet, my name is Katrina Luco, and I am the training specialist here at Donate Life Northwest. I work primarily in the Erase the Weight program, which is our Living Kidney mentorship program. However, my academic background is rooted in psychology and professional mental health, which makes me particularly passionate about bringing you this particular webinar series. So we do have a lot to cover today. With our technical difficulties, we're running a little bit behind. So without further ado, let's get started by taking a look at today's learning objectives. So in today's webinar, we will clearly define self-compassion and self-care. We will broaden our understanding of how self-compassion and self-care positively affect our mental, emotional, and physical health. We will learn to become more attuned to times when we may need a self-compassion or self-care boost. We'll gain some tools to help treat ourselves with more kindness and compassion. We'll identify key areas of self-care to incorporate into our daily and weekly routines, and we'll explore some easy self-care ideas. So we'll begin by discussing the heightened importance of self-compassion and self-care within the specific context of the current COVID-19 pandemic. So why are self-compassion and self-care so important right now? In the first webinar in this series, I explained how the COVID-19 outbreak encompasses three of the primary triggers for stress, worry, and anxiety, being that this current situation we're in is ambiguous and open to different interpretations. We keep getting conflicting information. People have different views on the situation at hand. It's also novel and new. We have no similar experience to reference. And it's also unpredictable. It's unclear how things will turn out. So you can see how all of these factors that are currently in play definitely are going to heighten our stress, worry, and anxiety. So while self-compassion and self-care are always essential elements of overall happiness and well-being, they become imperative during times of heightened stress, worry, and/or anxiety like we're currently experiencing. So this very much goes back to the old adage that you must first care for yourself in order to care for others. It rings loudly true in this particular situation. If you're not in a good place, characterized by balance, compassion, and inner peace, you're likely in no position to do your best work or be the best partner, parent, friend, or family member that you can be. So in potentially engaging in self-compassion and self-care helps to regulate our agitated nervous system, allows us to recharge our internal resources. Kindness and care towards self also helps us identify, process, and release negative emotions, which also tend to be a bit more on deck currently. So now that we know that self-compassion and self-care are more important now than ever, let's take a look at what each of them is all about. Oh, there was a little slide I skipped, but you get the gist from what I said. So in this next part, it may seem as though self-compassion and self-care are redundant terms. However, they are two distinct concepts with their own set of related actions. So to help clarify, we'll explore each of them in depth, beginning with self-compassion. So what is self-compassion? Self-compassion can be defined as being kind and understanding toward yourself when navigating a difficult time, confronting personal failure, or noticing something you don't like about yourself. Instead of mercilessly judging and criticizing yourself for various inadequacies or shortcomings, self-compassion means you are accepting of personal growth edges. Self-compassion also means that you act the same way toward yourself when you're going through a tough time that you would act toward a dear friend. This type of kindness to self involves noticing the suffering, empathizing or suffering with yourself, and offering yourself kindness and understanding. Instead of just ignoring your pain with a stiff upper lip mentality, you stop to tell yourself, this is really difficult right now. How can I comfort and care for myself in this moment? So in equal importance to knowing what self-compassion is, understanding what it isn't is also of importance. Dr. Kristin Neff, who is probably the foremost expert on self-compassion, has identified 5 myths about self-compassion that come up frequently. So we're going to take a look at each of them. The first myth is that self-compassion is a form of self-pity. This is one of the biggest myths about self-compassion, is that it means feeling sorry for yourself, when in fact, self-compassion is an antidote to self-pity and the tendency to whine about our bad luck. This isn't because self-compassion allows you to tune out the bad stuff. In fact, self-compassion makes us more willing to accept, experience, and acknowledge difficult feelings with kindness, which paradoxically helps us process and let go of those emotions more fully. Research shows that self-compassionate people are less likely to get swallowed up by self-pitying thoughts about how bad things are or how bad they are. That's one of the reasons self-compassionate people have better mental health. The second myth is that self-compassion is weakness. It's a common misconception that being compassionate toward ourselves is a sign of weakness. After all, we're supposed to be able to just grin and bear it while we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, right? However, instead of being a weakness, researchers are discovering that self-compassion is one of the most powerful sources of coping and resilience available to us. When we go through major life crises, self-compassion appears to make all the difference in our ability to survive and even thrive. The third myth is that self-compassion will make us complacent. Dr. Neff notes, perhaps the biggest block to self-compassion is the belief that it'll undermine our motivation to push ourselves to do better. She goes on to explain, the idea is that if we don't criticize ourselves for failing to live up to our standards, we'll automatically succumb to slothful defeatism. Dr. Neff dispels this myth by pointing out that there's now a good deal of research clearly showing that self-compassion is a far more effective force for personal motivation than self-punishment. She explains, when we can see beyond the distorting lens of harsh self-judgment, we get in touch with other parts of ourselves, the parts that care and want everyone, including ourselves, to be as healthy and happy as possible. This provides the encouragement and support needed to do our best and try again. Myth number 4 is that self-compassion is narcissistic. The idea that self-compassion is narcissistic hails from confusing self-compassion with self-esteem. The easiest way to dismantle this myth is to compare the two. Self-esteem refers to a positive evaluation of self-worth, perceived value, or how much we like ourselves. In American culture, high self-esteem requires standing out in a crowd, being special and above average, which can indeed lead to narcissistic behaviors and is often contingent on our latest success or failure. Self-compassion, on the other hand, isn't a judgment or an evaluation at all. Instead, it is a way of relating to the ever-changing landscape of who we are with kindness and acceptance, especially when we fail or feel inadequate. In other words, self-esteem requires feeling better than others, whereas self-compassion requires acknowledging that we share the human condition of imperfection. The last myth is that self-compassion is selfish. Dr. Neff states, many people are suspicious of self-compassion because they conflate it with selfishness. She challenges this myth by pointing out, when we can be kind and nurturing to ourselves, many of our emotional needs are met, leaving us in a better position to focus on others. She notes that in American culture, we hold an unfortunate idea that in order to meet the ideal of being modest, self-effacing, and caring for the welfare of others, we must treat ourselves badly. She explains, the irony is that being good to yourself actually helps you be good to others, while being bad to yourself only gets in the way. One of my all-time favorite quotes comes from writer and activist Audre Lorde, who wisely and aptly stated, "I have come to believe that caring for myself is not self-indulgent. Caring for myself is an act of survival." There is one last clarification I feel is important to explore in terms of better understanding what self-compassion is and what it isn't, and that's the difference between self-compassion and self-love. As you've heard throughout this presentation so far, there are a lot of what I refer to as self-hyphens in the land of personal growth, mental health, and holistic well-being, so it can be easy to mix them up or be unclear on the definitions. It may seem that self-compassion and self-love are interchangeable terms. However, they are in fact two distinct concepts. Self-love is defined as a state of appreciation for oneself that grows from actions that support our physical, psychological, and spiritual growth. Self-love is about valuing yourself as a human being who is worthy of love and respect. It's a more stable construct than self-compassion. While you can choose to be compassionate toward yourself in any moment, self-love is something that most of us need to build up over time. So to wrap up the comparison, self-compassion is being kind and understanding toward yourself in the face of challenges, whereas self-love is a continued state of appreciation for oneself that results from supporting our inner growth. So now let's take a look at some of the benefits of self-compassion. Simply put, it feels good and makes us happier when we love and forgive ourselves. Treating ourselves compassionately turns down the volume on our inner critic and the harsh negative narrative it's so fond of creating. Self-compassion also generates greater emotional resilience by increasing our ability to tap into patience, empathy, and forgiveness. Self-compassionate behavior prompts us to view ourselves through a more realistic lens, thus creating a more accurate self-concept and allowing us to get to know our authentic self better. Self-compassion also fosters more caring behavior within our relationships, decreases narcissism, and also decreases reactive anger. It's also important to note that self-compassion isn't just for ourselves. By calming our bodies and minds, self-compassion serves the people around us. Because humans are social creatures, we pick up on the emotions of others, the subtle body language and facial cues that slip through even when we're trying to hide them. So someone who exudes calm and warmth rather than harshness and distress can easily spread that peacefulness to others around them. So now we know what self-compassion is, but how do we actually go about treating ourselves more compassionately? Great news, that's what we're going to learn next. So let's take a look at the first steps on the journey to self-compassion. When beginning on our self-compassion journey, it's important to acknowledge and accept that self-compassion is often a radically new way of relating to ourselves. This is the piece I can't stress enough. Some of the activities or thoughts that you might be prompted to engage in when you're learning to be self-compassionate can feel highly uncomfortable. And so that acknowledgement and acceptance of the fact that you're trying something that is radically different than you've done before is really crucial to keep you going, to keep you from getting discouraged. Another piece of the first steps is just holding that remembrance that just like the development of any new habit, boosting self-compassion requires dedication, patience, and practice. I want to share some important insights from Dr. Neff, the self-compassion researcher. She has some notes that she feels are incredibly important for novice and experienced self-compassion practitioners alike. The first of which is to understand that self-compassion is a practice of goodwill, not good feelings. She explains, in other words, even though the friendly, supportive stance of self-compassion is aimed at the alleviation of suffering, we can't always control the way things are. If we use self-compassion practice to try to make our pain go away by suppressing it or fighting against it, things will likely get worse. As we've discussed, self-compassion allows us to mindfully accept that the moment is painful and to embrace ourselves with kindness and care in response, while remembering that imperfection is part of the shared human experience. Dr. Neff explains, this allows us to hold ourselves in love and connection, giving ourselves the support and comfort needed to bear the pain while providing the optimal conditions for growth and transformation. She also cautions, sometimes some people find that when they practice self-compassion, their pain actually increases at first. We call this phenomenon backdraft, a firefighting term that describes what happens when a door in a burning house is opened. Oxygen goes in and flames rush out. A similar process can occur when we open the door of our hearts. Love goes in and old pain comes out. Fortunately, we can meet old pain with the resources of mindfulness and self-compassion, and the heart will naturally begin to heal. Still, it means we have to allow ourselves to be slow learners when it comes to practicing self-compassion. It also means that if we ever feel overwhelmed by difficult emotions, the most self-compassionate response may be to pull back temporarily, focus on our breath, ground ourselves, or engage in simple acts of self-care, such as going for a walk, drinking a cup of coffee, or petting our animal companion. By doing so, we reinforce the habit of self-compassion, giving ourselves what we need in the moment and planting seeds that will eventually blossom and flourish. So again, she's emphasizing the importance of patience with self as you are working on building your self-compassion. So now that we have our self-compassion mindset in place, let's take a look at a few beginner's exercises to launch our self-compassion boost. These all come from Dr. Neff. Can you tell that I love and respect her work? She's kind of my self-compassion guru. So the first exercise is called How Would You Treat a Friend? This simple exercise only requires a piece of paper, a writing utensil, and a bit of reflective time. It's advisable that you give yourself a minimum of 15 minutes for this exercise. A good starting goal is to do this practice once a month, working up to engaging in it on a weekly basis. So I want to pause for a second and let you know that I will be following up this webinar by sending out all of these exercises. So if you're taking notes, don't feel like you have to scribble madly at this point in time. You will get these instructions via email as well. But I do just want to go over these so you get a general idea of what some of these exercises are and the types of things they'll help you explore in relation to self-compassion. So in this exercise, first you envision talking with a close friend who feels really bad about themselves or is struggling in some way. How would you respond to your friend in this situation, especially when you're at your best? Write down what you would do, what you would say, and be sure to note the tone in which you would talk to your friend. Next, think about times when you feel bad about yourself or are struggling. How do you typically respond to yourself in such situations? Write down what you typically do, what you say or hear yourself say in your inner dialogue, and note the tone in which you speak to yourself. Now ask yourself, is there a notable difference? If so, ask yourself why. What factors or fears come into play that lead you to treat yourself and others so differently? Lastly, write down how you think things might change if you responded to yourself in the same way you typically respond to a close friend when you're suffering. The takeaway to put into practice from this exercise is, why not try treating yourself like a good friend and see what happens? I have to say, as somebody who has worked in mental health, this piece is so huge. We tend to really speak to ourselves in ways we would never in a million years imagine speaking to someone we love and care about. And that just emphasizes the importance of building up love, compassion, and kindness for ourselves. The next exercise is a really simple one. It's called the self-compassion break. It only takes about 5 minutes. It's advisable that when you first start doing this, to do it at least once a week, and the idea is to work up to doing it daily. For this self-compassion break, you think about a time or situation in your life that is currently occurring and is causing you stress that's difficult, challenging for you to navigate. Then you call the situation to mind and try to really feel the stress and emotional discomfort that navigating this situation brings up in your body. And then say the following things to yourself. First, this is a moment of suffering. That statement is mindfulness. Other options include, this hurts. Ouch. This is stress. The idea is that you are mindfully validating your own suffering and the emotions that go along with that suffering. The second thing to say to yourself is, suffering is a part of life. This statement acknowledges common humanity. Other options include, other people feel this way too. I am not alone. We all struggle in our lives. Now, the exercise asks you to put your hands over your heart, feel the warmth of your hands and the gentle touch of your hands on your chest, or use a different type of soothing touch that feels right for you, and then say, may I be kind to myself. That statement is representative of self-kindness. You can also ask yourself, what do I need to hear right now in order to express kindness to myself? Is there a particular phrase that speaks to this situation? Some examples might be, may I give myself the compassion that I need? May I learn to accept myself as I am? May I forgive myself? May I be strong? May I be patient? This is a practice that can be used at any time of day or night and will help you remember to evoke the 3 aspects of self-compassion when you need them the most. I'm going to pause briefly before I go into the third and final self-compassion exercise, because this is about the time that many of us are going to start feeling those bubbles of resistance coming to the surface. It's uncomfortable to think about talking to ourselves this way, but really that just makes it all the more important that we do so. So let's take a look at the third and final self-compassion exercise, which is the self-compassionate letter. This exercise is my favorite of the ones that I'm sharing today. It does take a little more time and effort than the other 2, but I feel strongly that the short-term and longer-term rewards are worth it. Plus, this is all about taking time to be kind to ourselves. So the only supplies needed for this one, again, like the first, are just paper and a writing utensil. I would also advise doing this in a space that allows for some quiet reflection. You want at least 15 minutes for this exercise. I would say try not to cap the amount of time it takes. And a good starting goal is to do this practice once a month. And if it feels like something that's helpful for you, you could bump that up to doing it on a weekly basis or maybe a couple times a month. In this exercise, first you identify something about yourself that makes you feel ashamed, insecure, or not good enough. It could be something related to your personality, behavior, abilities, relationships, or any other part of your life. Once you identify something, write it down and describe how it makes you feel. Sad, embarrassed, angry. Try to be as honest as possible, keeping in mind that no one but you will see what you write. The next step is to write a letter to yourself, expressing compassion, understanding, and acceptance for the part of yourself that you dislike. As you write, follow these guidelines. Imagine that there is someone who loves and accepts you unconditionally for who you are. What would that person say to you about this part of yourself? Remind yourself that everyone has things about themselves that they don't like and that no one is without flaws. Think about how many other people in the world are struggling with the same thing that you're struggling with. Consider the ways in which events that have happened in your life, the family environment you grew up in, or even the genes that you have may have contributed to the negative aspect of yourself. In a compassionate way, ask yourself whether there are things that you could do to improve or better cope with this negative aspect. Focus on how constructive changes could make you feel happier, healthier, and more fulfilled, and help avoid judging yourself. After writing the letter, put it down for a little while, then come back to it later and read it again. It may be especially helpful to read whenever you're feeling bad about this aspect of yourself as a reminder to be more self-compassionate. So now that we have a good grasp on what self-compassion is and how to begin increasing our ability to treat ourselves with loving kindness, let's turn our attention to self-care, which happens to be an integral component of self-compassion. So what is self-care? It's the practice of taking an active role in protecting your own well-being and happiness, in particular during periods of stress. Mental health therapist Dr. Maria Barada explains that self-care is the mindful taking of time to pay attention to you, not in a narcissistic way, but in a way that ensures that you are being cared for by you. Self-care refers to activities and practices that we deliberately engage in on a regular basis to reduce stress and maintain and enhance our short and longer-term mental, emotional, and physical health. Activities that can be categorized as self-care vary from person to person. Self-care is necessary for your effectiveness and success in honoring your professional and personal commitments. So what is self-care not? It's not arbitrarily adding more to our to-do list. It's about identifying our essential needs and prioritizing them. Self-care is not something that we force ourselves to do or don't enjoy. It's about activities that refuel us rather than take from us. Self-care is not an emergency response plan that's only enacted when stress becomes overwhelming and burnout is looming. It's about creating behaviors or healthy habits that nurture us. And perhaps most importantly, self-care is not an act of selfishness, just like we mentioned with self-compassion. Self-care is about looking after ourselves so that we are able to give our best and provide value to the world by living peacefully and sharing our gifts. So what are some of the benefits of self-care? Practicing self-care benefits us in multiple ways. It helps us identify and manage the general life challenges that we all face, such as stress, work burnout, and interpersonal difficulties. It helps to improve self-awareness around our personal vulnerabilities. In other words, what drains us emotionally, mentally, physically, or spiritually. Also helps us build awareness around our personal needs. What do we need as individuals to maintain emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual health? Self-care helps us reduce stress, worry, and anxiety. It helps us achieve greater life balance, and it assists us in improving overall happiness and well-being. Self-care also gets us spending more time engaging in rewarding activities that we find intrinsically rewarding, things that spark that inner joy, that feed us, that nourish us internally. Self-care means spending more time engaging, I just read that one. Self-care means increasing our sense of self-worth. It also helps us to reduce the negative self-talk I mentioned earlier. It helps us treat ourselves with more kindness, patience, and compassion. Self-care allows us to branch out, try new things, discover new interests, and also gain clarity around activities that we don't like. And lastly, it gives us more mental, emotional, and physical energy to care for and engage with loved ones in the ways that we truly want to. So, as I mentioned previously, the actual activities that we engage in for self-care will differ from person to person. However, there are 6 general areas of self-care that we should be mindful of incorporating in our daily and weekly routines. They're represented here on this great self-care wheel, which is another piece that I will send out to you following the webinar. So let me just speak briefly about these 6 areas here. The first is psychological, which is involving learning new things, perspective taking, engaging intrinsic motivation, practicing mindfulness, and utilizing our creativity. Next up is emotional, which involves enhancing our emotional vocabulary, navigating and processing emotions, increasing empathy, managing stress effectively, and increasing compassion for self and others. The next area is physical, which involves movement of the body, general health maintenance, nutrition, hydration, sleep, rest, physical touch, and sexual needs. Next up, we have personal and social, which involves fostering self-growth, identifying personal needs and values, goal or intention setting, building and engaging with a strong support network, and having a sense of belongingness and connectedness. The next area is professional, which involves identifying and living our purpose, sharing our strengths and gifts, and having clear professional boundaries. Lastly is spiritual, which involves identifying and living in alignment with the beliefs that are important to us, developing spiritual awareness, and positively contributing to the human collective. 2 other important areas of self-care that can stand alone or be incorporated into the 6 categories we've already covered are financial, which involves being responsible with our finances and maintaining a conscious relationship with our money, and environmental, which involves having organized, well-maintained, and clutter-free home and work environments, minimizing waste, and monitoring technology and screen time. So again, I want to emphasize that each of our lives is unique and has its own distinctive demands. Consequently, we each must determine what self-care means for us and how to apply it in our lives. Additionally, each of us may differ in the domains or areas that we emphasize and the balance we seek among them based on our individual needs and values. So now that we have a good idea of what self-care is, let's take a look at how to begin integrating mindful acts of self-care into our lives. When it comes to self-care, a great idea to start with is taking a self-care assessment. A self-care assessment will help you think about how frequently or how well you are performing different self-care activities. The goal is to help you learn about your self-care needs by spotting patterns and recognizing areas of your life that need more attention. Most self-care assessments use multiple choice or ranking formats and encompass the primary categories of self-care that we just reviewed. You can find a variety of self-care assessments online, and I will also include one in the email following the webinar. If you prefer to assess your current levels of self-care in a more free-flowing way through writing, you can do so via reflective questions, such as, what does self-care mean for you? How do you currently take care of yourself? And what self-care practice can you incorporate into your life today? I will include those reflective questions in the follow-up email as well. So what about some tips to help us on this self-care journey? The first is to make self-care a priority. There will always be other things to do, but don't let these interrupt the time that you set aside for self-care. Self-care should be given the same importance as other responsibilities. Next, set specific self-care goals or intentions. It's difficult to follow through with vague goals such as, I will take more time for self-care. Instead, try something specific such as, I will walk for 30 minutes every evening after dinner. Next, make self-care a habit. Just like eating one apple doesn't eliminate health problems, using self-care just once won't have much effect on reducing stress. Choose activities that you can do often and that you will realistically stick with. Set boundaries to protect your self-care. You don't need a major obligation to say no to others. Your self-care is reason enough. Remind yourself that your needs are as important as anyone else's. Next, share your plans. Once you've developed your self-care plan and made your commitment, remember that friends, family, peers, and or colleagues may be good additional resources for exchanging new self-care ideas and strategies, and also an awesome source of support and encouragement. Next up, remember that a few minutes of self-care is better than no self-care. Set an alarm reminding you to take regular breaks, even if it's just a walk around the block or an uninterrupted snack. Oftentimes, stepping away will energize you to work more efficiently when you return. Also, as much as we might like them to, unhealthy activities don't count as self-care. Substance use, overeating, and other unhealthy behaviors might hide uncomfortable emotions temporarily, but they cause more problems in the long run. Lastly, keep up with self-care even when you're feeling good. Doing so will keep you in a healthy routine, plus self-care might be part of the reason why you're feeling good. So next up, in terms of kind of getting into the self-care groove, this piece is really important. You might need to reconceptualize your idea of self-care. It doesn't need to be time-consuming, physically draining, or costly. In fact, sometimes it's the quick, simple things that happen on a regular basis that keep us rejuvenated. Often, to get the appropriate amount of self-care on a consistent basis, we need to reconceptualize and simplify our understanding of self-care. Begin by focusing on basic self-care activities that can be easily incorporated into your daily or weekly schedule. A few ideas are nourish, eat healthy meals, drink water, and avoid alcohol and other toxins. What we put into our bodies directly impacts how we feel, not only physically, but mentally and emotionally as well. Another great self-care is to move. Exercise, stretch, walk, do yoga, play sports, hike. Research shows that exercise can relieve stress, reduce anxiety, improve mood, decrease impression, and help you sleep better. Next, a really simple one that works wonders is to practice gratitude. Start a written or verbal daily gratitude practice. Expressing gratitude helps us connect with positivity, joy, and vitality. This is also a great piece of self-care to enlist your family members in. Make it a time for sharing gratitude together, perhaps at dinner each night or as you're tucking your kiddos into bed. Other self-care basics include sleep and napping. Be mindful of getting adequate restful sleep. Quality sleep is essential to overall health and is closely linked to professional and academic success. Napping throughout the day can also help improve energy levels. Another crucial part of self-care is connecting with others. Reach out to friends and family, share your feelings, and strengthen your support system. Take time to connect, even if it's only possible virtually. Research demonstrates that spending time with loved ones is the #1 determinant of happiness. Also, when it comes to self-care, setting a routine is in itself a piece of self-care. That was a lot of self in one sentence. Create a daily structure, maintain a regular routine, and stick to a schedule. This will help you feel more in control of your life, especially during these current unpredictable times. Next up is to unplug. It may feel imperative to constantly check news for updates on the pandemic, but doing so can trigger anxiety. Set limits on your daily media intake and overall screen time. Research suggests that time away from technology replenishes the brain's stores of attention and motivation and encourages both productivity and creativity. Next easy piece of self-care is to breathe. Take at least 5 minutes a day to practice deep breathing. In just those few minutes, you can lower your blood pressure and heart rate, thus lowering the physical effects of stress. Also, a great piece of self-care is spending time in nature. Aim to spend at least a bit of time outside each day, whether in your backyard, a local park, or embarking on a larger adventure like going for a hike. Connecting with nature has remarkable benefits on human health and spiritual wellness. The last way to ease into some basic self-care is to journal. Take a few minutes each day to journal in a free writing format, allowing whatever comes to flow out. Journaling has a lot of benefits. It can help you process your feelings, stimulate creativity centers in the brain, identify needs, and help you be present in the moment. Another idea when you're getting started with self-care, and I apologize, that photo is from the last presentation and very much does not go with this slide. So let's just pretend it's not there. But another idea when you're starting off with self-care is to take a self-care challenge. Joining a self-care challenge can be a helpful way to add structure to your initial self-care endeavors and reduce the amount of thinking and planning required on your end. Self-care challenges typically run for a specific length of time, such as 1 week or 1 month, and outline a specific activity for each day of the challenge. They usually take place via social media, allowing you to connect virtually with other participants who are working on their own self-care. Although I do have some mixed feelings about the hashtag worthiness of self-care in this golden age of social media, I do really appreciate the accountability and camaraderie inherent to participating in a self-care challenge. You can likely find multiple self-care challenges launching at any given time, especially if you search toward the beginning of any given month. You may also be able to find one that isn't currently live, but still provides you with a list of daily self-care activities. Pinterest is a great source for those. So I fully acknowledge that I've thrown a large amount of information at you so far today. I don't expect that it will all stick, but I do hope that it's planted some seeds of interest. So I'll share a few resources and recommendations if you choose to take a deeper dive into these topics. First, I have some reading recommendations. The first is the Self-Compassion book written by Kristin Neff, who I have referenced various times throughout this presentation. Great piece and wonderful information in there. Also incredibly helpful is a book called The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion by another expert on the topic, Dr. Christopher Germer. There's also a great book by Brene Brown, who is a clinical social worker and a researcher. It's called The Gift of Imperfection. Let go of who you think you're supposed to be and embrace who you are. Definitely speaks a lot to these components of self-compassion and self-care. The last one I threw in here is a little bit different, but I personally think it still relates. It's called My Friend Fear, Finding Magic in the Unknown, and it chronicles an artist's journey through becoming friends with anxiety and the fears that were holding her back, and getting to know herself better in the process, and also becoming freer in her creative expression. It's also a very beautiful book with her watercolor artwork throughout it. There are also a couple of workbooks that can be really helpful. Doctors Neff and Germer have combined their expertise and years upon years of research into self-compassion to create the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook, which walks you through step-by-step of building your own self-compassion, and has a number of exercises along the way, as well as just general information on self-compassion. Also, the same artist, Miralee Patel, has a interactive workbook journal called Start Where You Are that has some very basic prompts for self-exploration. If you are more of a website type of person, these are some great sources on the internet for information about self-compassion and self-care. Greater Good Science Center, which is located at UC Berkeley, is an amazing wealth of information. They provide science-based insights for meaningful life via groundbreaking research into the roots of compassion, happiness, and altruism. The site has a ton of very informative articles, also has a lot of exercises, activities, meditations that you can access. For those of you who are parents, they also have a section on the website that is really specifically honed in on helping kiddos develop compassion and self-care and live their best kiddo lives. Selfcompassion.org is Kristin Neff's website. It provides more research-based information on self-compassion along with guided meditations. Some of the exercises that I've shared today are included on her website, and she's got some other great resources. The last one is the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion, which again is Drs. Neff and Germer, along with some of their other colleagues, and it aims to contribute to a more compassionate world through cultivating deep understanding and personal practice of self-compassion. They've got online courses and other resources on that site. I am being mindful of the fact that we are coming up close to time, but I've just got a little bit more to squeeze in. As we are in the home stretch here, I'd like to provide a gentle reminder that if you are seeking to increase self-compassion and self-care because you are experiencing disruptive or uncontrollable levels of stress, worry, or anxiety, please ask for help. There is help out there. People that you can begin talking to would be a counselor or therapist, your primary care doctor, a spiritual leader. There are multiple different crisis helplines that you can find, many of which are specified to specific audiences, such as people experiencing suicidal ideation, elders, veterans, folks struggling with substance abuse. And you can also always feel free to reach out to us here at Donate Life Northwest. We are always happy to support our community members in any way that we can. So before we move into the Q&A portion, which we really don't have time for, I'm going to refer back to the expertise of Dr. Kristin Neff and share with you her eloquent explanation of the importance of treating ourselves with love and kindness. I just think this is a wonderful piece of closing wisdom. So Dr. Neff emphasizes, when we care tenderly for ourselves in response to suffering, our heart opens. Compassion engages our capacity for love, wisdom, courage, and generosity. It's a mental and emotional state that's boundless and directionless, grounded in the spiritual traditions of the world, but available to every person simply by virtue of being a human. In a surprising twist, the nurturing power of self-compassion is now being illuminated by the matter-of-fact, tough-minded methods of empirical science, and a growing body of research literature is demonstrating conclusively that self-compassion is not only central to mental health, but can be enriched through learning and practice, just like so many other good habits. As therapists have known for a long time, being kind to ourselves isn't, as too often believed, a selfish luxury, but the exercise of a gift that makes us happier. So I did intend to have a Q&A section, but for the sake of time, I am going to skip over that. But I will invite you, if you have any questions, comments, would like more information about anything I've discussed, to please feel free to email me directly. My email address is my last name, Liukko, L-I-U-K-K-O, @ohsu.edu. I also want to remind everybody, as I've mentioned throughout the webinar, that I will be sending up a follow-up email. That email will include a link to the recording of this session, as well as a recording of the first session in case you missed it. It will also contain a number of handouts, worksheets, and resources that I've mentioned throughout the presentation. Also a reminder that this is the second webinar in a 4-part series. So the next webinar will be in 2 weeks on May 7th at this same place, same time. And it will be focusing on letting go of control. And then the fourth and final webinar in this series will take place on May 21st. Again, same place, same time. And in that one, we'll be looking at finding life balance. I will send registration links for both of those webinars in the follow-up email. You can also go to donatelifenw.org/calendar to register for those events. So with that, I'm going to say thank you so much for joining us today. Take care, be kind to yourself, and be well. Thank you.